She had disappeared without explanation, vanishing from London society like morning mist. For an entire season, Duke Ashford had made her name synonymous with scandal, speaking of her fickleness and betrayal at every ballroom, every soirée, every gathering of consequence. The Ton whispered her disgrace over tea and champagne. But when a rain-soaked letter fell from behind a loose panel in his study, a letter dated 18 months prior, addressed to him in her familiar hand, his blood turned to ice. The words swam before his eyes, and with each sentence, the truth he had never known shattered the righteous anger he had carried like armor. What he had mistaken for abandonment had been the greatest sacrifice, and he had destroyed her for it. If you are listening to this story, do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Miss Eloise Pemberton had been raised to understand her place in the world with crystalline clarity. The second daughter of Viscount Pemberton, her path had been meticulously arranged since childhood, each year bringing her closer to the inevitable conclusion: marriage to someone of appropriate standing, preferably with a fortune to shore up her family's dwindling estate. The Pembertons had once been among England's most prosperous families, their lands in Hertfordshire vast and productive. But poor investments, a series of unfortunate harvests, and her father's penchant for gaming had steadily eroded their security until only their title and their London townhouse remained as testament to former glory. Eloise had known, since she was 16, that she would be the family's salvation. Her elder sister Catherine had married adequately but without spectacular success, a baronet with a comfortable income but no grand estate. That left Eloise to restore the family fortunes, and Providence, it seemed, had smiled upon them. At 18, during her first season, she had captured the attention of one of England's most eligible bachelors, Alexander Thornhill, Duke of Ashford. The Duke was everything a young woman might dream of in the abstract. At 30 years of age, he possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that painters favoured. Sharp cheekbones, penetrating grey eyes, dark hair that he wore slightly longer than fashion dictated. His estate, Ashford Park in Somerset, was legendary, spanning thousands of acres, with a manor house that dated to the Elizabethan era. His fortune was estimated at £30,000 per annum, perhaps more. He was educated, articulate, and moved through society with the easy confidence of a man who had never questioned his place at its pinnacle. Their courtship had unfolded with the stately inevitability of a minuet. They had been introduced at Lady Harrington's ball, had danced twice, a significant declaration of interest. He had called upon her family the following week, bringing flowers and engaging her father in discussions of land management and parliamentary matters. He had taken her driving in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, where all of London could observe them together. He had secured invitations to ensure they would attend the same events, had sought her out for the supper dance at every ball, had made his intentions unmistakable. Eloise had accepted his attentions with gratitude and a cautious, growing warmth. The Duke was not effusive in his affections, that would have been beneath his dignity, but he was attentive and proper. He spoke to her of his estate, of his responsibilities to his tenants, of his expectations for a wife who would manage Ashford Park with grace and efficiency. He did not speak of love, but Eloise had been raised to understand that affection might grow with time, that respect and compatibility were more reliable foundations than passion. In her private moments, brushing her honey-blonde hair before her mirror or walking in the small garden behind their townhouse, Eloise allowed herself to dream. Perhaps the Duke would come to care for her deeply. Perhaps she would find happiness as his Duchess, presiding over grand dinners, raising children who would never know the anxiety of unpaid bills and creditors at the door. Perhaps she could be more than a strategic alliance. The engagement had been announced in the Times after 3 months of courtship. The wedding was set for the following spring, allowing time for a proper trousseau to be assembled and for the banns to be read. Eloise's mother had wept with relief. Her father had clapped the Duke on the shoulder with grateful bonhomie. Catherine had whispered congratulations tinged with envy. The season continued, and Eloise moved through it as the Duke's acknowledged betrothed accorded a new status and deference. She attended the opera in his box. She was seated at his right hand at dinner parties. She met his few close friends and was introduced to his formidable grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, who had examined her with shrewd blue eyes before pronouncing her adequate, provided she produces an heir. But beneath the glittering surface, Eloise began to notice fissures. The Duke's attentiveness, while outwardly correct, held a quality of assessment rather than affection. He corrected her opinions when they differed from his own, gently but firmly, as though she were a promising student requiring guidance. He made decisions about their future without consultation. The guest list for the wedding, the allocation of rooms at Ashford Park, even the colour of her wedding gown, which his grandmother insisted must be ivory silk rather than white. When Eloise tentatively suggested she might continue her watercolour painting after their marriage, the Duke had smiled indulgently. A pleasant hobby for a young lady. But a duchess has more serious obligations. You will find little time for such diversions. When she mentioned a book she had read, he had dismissed the author as sensationalist and recommended she confine herself to more improving literature. Still, these were small concerns, easily rationalized. The Duke was older, established in his ways, accustomed to authority. She would adjust. She would learn to be what he required. The alternative, the ruin of her family, her father's potential imprisonment for debt, was unthinkable. The winter months passed in a blur of fittings and planning. Eloise's trousseau grew to fill an entire room. Morning dresses and evening gowns, nightgowns of delicate lawn, travelling costumes, bonnets and gloves and stockings. Her mother spoke endlessly of the wedding breakfast, the guest list that had swelled to 300, the flowers that must be ordered from the best hothouse in London. It was in February, when daffodils were just beginning to push through the frozen earth in the London squares, that everything changed. Eloise's younger brother Thomas had been away at Oxford for the Michaelmas term. She had not seen him since September, though they exchanged letters regularly. Thomas was 20 years old, bright and earnest, with dreams of entering the diplomatic service. He was the family's other hope, a son who might restore their fortunes through his own achievements, rather than advantageous marriage. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by regular post but by special messenger. Eloise had been breakfasting with her mother when the butler brought it in. His face carefully neutral, but his hands trembling slightly as he presented the sealed envelope to her father. The Viscount had read it in silence, his complexion draining of colour, his hands beginning to shake. When he looked up, his eyes were those of a man facing execution. "Thomas has been expelled," he said, his voice hollow. "There are debts, gaming debts, £5,000. The words had hung in the air like smoke. £5,000, an impossible sum, more than her father's annual income, enough to destroy them completely. But worse than the amount was the identity of the creditor. The debts were owed to Lord Reginald Ashford, the Duke's younger brother, a man notorious for his cruel pleasures and his habit of luring young men into games of chance they could not afford to lose. The Duke was informed, of course. He arrived at the Pemberton townhouse that very afternoon, his expression carved from granite. The interview in her father's study lasted 20 minutes. Eloise had stood in the hallway, her ear pressed to the door, catching fragments. "Your son's character, reflection on your family, cannot possibly. Beg you, your grace. The boy is young. I will find the money somehow. My decision is final. I cannot ally myself with a family of such demonstrated irresponsibility." When the Duke emerged, he had not looked at Eloise. He had simply handed her father a letter, a formal dissolution of the engagement, and departed. No explanation to her, no conversation, no opportunity for her to plead their case or explain that Thomas had been manipulated, entrapped by a man who made sport of destroying the less powerful. The notice appeared in the Times the following morning. The engagement between His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, and Miss Eloise Pemberton is dissolved by mutual consent. There was nothing mutual about it. Everyone who read it would know she had been cast aside. The timing of the broken engagement could not have been more devastating. The season was in full swing, London bursting with the annual influx of aristocratic families come to secure marriages, conduct business, and see and be seen. Every ballroom, every drawing room, every promenade in Hyde Park became a stage upon which Eloise's disgrace played out in excruciating detail. The Duke did not merely end their engagement and retreat into silence. That might have been interpreted as gentlemanly discretion, allowing rumours to fade through neglect. Instead, Alexander Thornhill took a different path entirely, one of deliberate, systematic destruction. He spoke to everyone, in every venue. At Lady Carmichael's musicale, 3 nights after the announcement, Eloise had attended with her mother, both of them armoured in dignity they did not feel. They had hoped that the intimate nature of the gathering, 30 guests at most, might offer some refuge. Instead, it became the first battlefield. Eloise had been seated near the pianoforte, trying to focus on the young soprano's performance, when she heard the Duke's voice behind her during the interval. He was speaking to Lord Pembroke and Sir William Chester, his tone carrying just far enough to ensure she could hear every word. A fortunate escape, truly. One cannot be too careful about family character. Irresponsibility breeds true, they say. The father's gambling, the son's debts. One dreads to imagine what other deficiencies might have emerged after the vows were spoken. Lord Pembroke had murmured something diplomatic. "No, no," the Duke had continued, "I am quite at peace with my decision. Better a broken engagement than a lifetime shackled to mediocrity. Miss Pemberton presented herself well enough on the surface, but there was always something insubstantial about her, agreeable but ultimately forgettable. I require more substance in a duchess." The words had struck like physical blows. Eloise had sat rigid, her face burning, knowing that everyone around her had heard, and was now carefully not looking at her. Her mother's hand had found hers beneath her reticule, squeezing hard enough to hurt. But that was only the beginning. At the theatre, at Almack's, at garden parties and routs and breakfasts, the Duke was there, always with a comment, always with an observation designed to cement her social death. He told Lady Jersey that he had discovered troubling tendencies toward deception in Eloise's character. He suggested to the Dowager Countess of Rotherhithe that Eloise had been grasping in her attempts to secure a duke, implying she had pursued him rather than the other way around. He mentioned to a group at White's, knowing full well the story would circulate, that he had narrowly avoided being trapped by a family of social climbers. Each comment was calibrated for maximum damage, while remaining just within the bounds of gentleman conduct. He never shouted, never made scenes. His voice remained cool and measured, his expression one of faint regret, as though he were simply sharing unfortunate truths for the general good of society. The Ton, hungry for scandal as always, devoured it. Within a fortnight, Eloise Pemberton's name had become synonymous with family disgrace and desperate social climbing. Invitations ceased arriving at the Pemberton townhouse. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Young men who had once solicited her for dances now looked through her as though she were invisible. The cruelest moment came at the Duchess of Devonshire's ball, one of the premier events of the season. The Pembertons had been invited weeks prior, before the broken engagement, and Eloise's mother had insisted they attend. "We cannot simply disappear," she had said, her voice tight with desperation. "That would be an admission of guilt. We must face them down." Eloise had worn her most beautiful gown, pale blue silk with delicate embroidery, made for her engagement announcement and never worn. She had held her head high as they entered the ballroom, her hand trembling only slightly on her father's arm. For a moment she had dared to hope that perhaps the Duke would not be present, that she might have one evening of peace. Then she had seen him. He was dancing with Miss Charlotte Beaumont, a stunning brunette whose father was an earl and whose dowry was rumoured to be £20,000. Charlotte was everything Eloise was not: confident, witty, from an unblemished family of impeccable standing. She laughed at something the Duke said, her head tilting back to reveal a graceful neck adorned with sapphires. As the dance ended, the Duke led Charlotte directly past where Eloise stood with her parents. He did not look at Eloise. He did not acknowledge her existence in any way, but Charlotte did. The younger woman's eyes swept over Eloise with unconcealed triumph, her lips curving in a smile that was almost pity, but not quite. "I understand," Charlotte said sweetly to the Duke, her voice pitched to carry, "that your former engagement ended most fortunately. How relieved you must be to have discovered the truth before making an irreversible mistake." The Duke had smiled, actually smiled. "Indeed, Miss Beaumont, Providence protects those who wait for the proper match. One must never settle for less than what one deserves." The words echoed through Eloise's mind for days afterward. Less than what one deserves. Insubstantial, forgettable, mediocre. Each adjective he had applied to her became a brand burned into her consciousness. The worst part was not knowing why Thomas's debts to the Duke's brother had been such an insurmountable obstacle. Yes, gaming debts were disgraceful, but they were also common among young men of their class. Fathers paid them quietly, sons were lectured, and society moved on. Many of the Duke's own circle had similar scandals in their pasts. Why was her family's lapse unforgivable, and why did he feel compelled to destroy her so thoroughly? A quiet ending would have served his purposes. Instead, he was ensuring that not only would she never marry a man of his rank, but she would be fortunate to receive any respectable offer at all. He was systematically dismantling her future, her reputation, her very sense of self. By the end of April, when the season should have been approaching its glorious conclusion, Eloise had stopped attending events altogether. She could not bear one more pitying glance, one more whispered conversation that stopped when she entered a room. One more evening of standing alone while others danced. Her father had aged a decade in 2 months, his shoulders bowed under the weight of their disgrace. Her mother moved through the house like a ghost, all her dreams of social triumph transformed to ashes. And Thomas, poor Thomas, who had returned from Oxford in shame, locked himself in his room and would speak to no one. The £5,000 still hung over them like a sword. Lord Reginald Ashford had generously agreed not to pursue immediate legal action, but only because Eloise suspected he was enjoying watching them slowly suffocate under the weight of the debt. Late one night in early May, Eloise sat at her writing desk and faced the truth she had been avoiding. London was lost to her. The season was lost. Her prospects were lost. If she remained, she would become nothing more than a cautionary tale, pointed out to other young ladies as an example of what happened when one aspired above one's station. She would have to leave. The question was where to go and how to fund the escape. Her aunt, her father's sister Cordelia, lived in Bath, a respectable city of retired gentlefolk and invalids, far from the glittering cruelty of London. Aunt Cordelia had written several times offering refuge. Perhaps it was time to accept. The decision, once made, brought a strange sort of peace. Eloise penned her letter that night, sealed it with wax, and placed it on the hall table for morning post. She would leave London at the end of the week. She would leave behind everything she had been raised to desire, and somehow, somewhere, she would find a way to become someone other than the woman the Duke of Ashford had scorned. Bath in late May was a city of honey-coloured stone and healing waters, its Georgian crescents curving gracefully around hills that overlooked the Avon Valley. Eloise arrived in the early morning, travelling by mail coach because her family could not afford a private carriage, her possessions reduced to 2 trunks containing what remained of her trousseau that had not yet been sold to pay Thomas's debts. Aunt Cordelia met her at the coach-yard, a woman of 55 years with iron-grey hair, intelligent hazel eyes, and a manner that suggested she tolerated no nonsense. She embraced Eloise firmly, asked no questions about the scandal, and simply said, "You will stay as long as necessary. My home is your home." Cordelia Pemberton had never married, a fact that had caused considerable family consternation over the years. She had refused every suitor, preferring instead to inherit a modest income from a godmother and establish herself in Bath as an independent woman of letters. She wrote essays on political reform and women's education under a masculine pseudonym. She hosted a salon every Thursday evening where intellectuals, reformers and artists gathered to debate ideas that would have scandalized London drawing rooms. For the first fortnight, Eloise did little but sleep, read and walk the hills surrounding the city. The wounds were too fresh for conversation. Cordelia respected her silence, offering only companionship without demands. They breakfasted together, dined quietly, and spent evenings in the drawing room, Cordelia working on her essays, while Eloise stared into the fire and tried not to think of grey eyes and cold dismissals. But slowly, imperceptibly, the rhythm of Bath began to work its restorative magic. The city was full of people who had come to escape or recover, from illness, from loss, from disappointment. No one asked intrusive questions. No one seemed to know or care about London scandals. Eloise was simply Miss Pemberton, the niece of Miss Cordelia Pemberton, and that was identity enough. It was at one of Cordelia's Thursday salons, 6 weeks after Eloise's arrival, that everything began to shift. The drawing room was full of people Eloise had never encountered in London's ballrooms. A retired naval captain who had served under Nelson, a young clergyman passionate about prison reform, 2 women who ran a school for the working poor, an artist whose landscape paintings hung in the academy, and a physician recently returned from establishing a hospital in India. Eloise had meant to simply observe from the corner, invisible and quiet. But the physician, Dr. Marcus Fielding, had noticed her sitting alone and approached with 2 glasses of wine. "You are Miss Cordelia's niece," he said without preamble. "She mentioned you had come from London. I hope you are finding Bath restorative. The city has a remarkable capacity for healing if one allows it." Dr. Fielding was perhaps 35, with dark auburn hair beginning to grey at the temples, warm brown eyes, and an air of competent calm. His accent marked him as educated but provincial, not London aristocracy but solid professional class. "I find it quieter," Eloise said carefully, "which is not unwelcome." "Ah, escaping noise then?" His eyes were perceptive but kind. "London can be unbearably loud, particularly when one becomes the subject of unwanted attention." Eloise felt heat rise in her cheeks. So her scandal had reached even here. Dr. Fielding seemed to sense her discomfort. "I apologize. I did not mean to distress you. I only meant to say that Bath is an excellent place for becoming something other than what London decided you should be. I speak from experience. You were the subject of scandal. Not scandal exactly, but I was considered peculiar. I insisted on attending actual patients rather than simply prescribing fashionable treatments from a comfortable consulting room. I argued for hospital reform and published papers suggesting that cleanliness might prevent infection. Radical notions, apparently. My peers in London found me tedious and idealistic. So I went to India, where there was too much work and too much suffering for anyone to care about my methods, only my results. Despite herself, Eloise felt a flicker of interest. "And now you have returned? To establish a practice here, and to write a comprehensive text on tropical diseases. Bath provides access to London publishers while allowing me to avoid London itself." He smiled. "Geography as diplomatic solution." Over the following weeks, Dr. Fielding became a regular presence. He attended every Thursday salon, always seeking Eloise out for conversation. He spoke to her not of fashion or weather, but of ideas, medical ethics, the education of women, the social structures that created poverty and disease. He asked her opinions, and then actually listened to her answers, occasionally disagreeing, but always with respect rather than condescension. "You have an incisive mind," he told her one evening after she had offered a critique of a proposed sanitation reform. "Have you considered writing? Your aunt's intellect seems to run in the family." Eloise had laughed, the sound surprising her. When was the last time she had laughed? "I was educated to manage a household and make pleasant conversation. Writing was never part of the curriculum." "Education is not only what others teach us," Dr. Fielding said. "It is what we choose to learn. If you wished to write, I imagine you could teach yourself quite readily." The idea lodged in her mind like a seed. Write. About what? For whom? But the possibility itself was intoxicating. The notion that she might create something, contribute something, be something other than an ornament or a disappointment. Cordelia, observing the growing friendship, offered gentle encouragement. "Marcus is a good man," she said one morning over breakfast. "Not fashionable, not wealthy, but genuinely good. Such men are rarer than diamonds and considerably more valuable." "He is a friend," Eloise said quickly. "Nothing more." "Certainly, for now." Cordelia's smile was knowing. "But friendship is how the best marriages begin, with respect and genuine affection rather than strategic alliance." Eloise had not considered marriage. The Duke's rejection had burned that dream to cinders. But as summer deepened and her time in Bath extended, she began to imagine a different future. Not a duchess presiding over a grand estate, but perhaps a physician's wife, managing a household that also served as a surgery, hosting intellectual gatherings, maybe even writing articles or essays under her own name. It would not be the future her mother had dreamed for her, but it might be one she actually wanted. In August, Dr. Fielding asked if she would assist him with a project. He was compiling case studies from his time in India and needed someone to organize his notes, edit his prose for clarity, and help prepare the manuscript for publication. "Your aunt suggested you might have both the skill and the interest," he said. "I can offer only modest payment, but the work itself might prove engaging." Eloise accepted immediately. The work was challenging and utterly absorbing. Dr. Fielding's notes were brilliant but chaotic, full of medical terminology and observations that needed to be translated for a general audience. She spent hours at his consulting rooms, surrounded by papers, asking questions, suggesting revisions, learning about diseases she had never heard of, and treatments that seemed almost miraculous. They worked side by side through the late summer and into autumn. The professional relationship deepened into friendship, and friendship began to shade into something more. Dr. Fielding never presumed, never overstepped, but his regard was evident in the way he sought her counsel, the way he smiled when she entered the room, the way he spoke of his future in terms that seemed to include space for her. One October evening, as they were walking back from his consulting rooms to Cordelia's house, he said quietly, "I am aware that you came to Bath to escape heartbreak. I do not wish to press you or cause you distress, but I would be remiss if I did not tell you that I have come to hold you in the highest regard, not despite what London thinks of you, but because of who you have revealed yourself to be: intelligent, resilient, kind. Whenever you are ready to consider a future, I hope you will know that I would be honored to be part of it." It was not a proposal, not quite, but it was a promise, that she need not fear being alone, that she was valued, that someone saw her true worth. Eloise had not cried since leaving London, but that night in the safety of her room, she wept. For the girl she had been so desperate to secure a duke's approval, for the months of humiliation, for the family she had left in disgrace. But also, finally, for the future that might still be possible, a future she could choose. By the following spring, Eloise Pemberton had become a different woman than the one who had fled London in shame. She dressed more simply, her gowns purchased ready-made rather than commissioned from fashionable modistes. She wore her hair in a practical style rather than elaborate curls. She had published 3 articles in a medical journal under the initials EP, summarizing aspects of Dr. Fielding's research for educated lay readers. She was learning Latin to better understand medical texts. She realized with some surprise, happy. It was Cordelia who suggested, half in jest, half in earnest, that perhaps they should attend the Bath Assembly Rooms for the spring season opening. "You cannot hide forever," she said, "and I confess I am curious to see how you will conduct yourself now that you have remembered who you are." The assembly rooms on a subscription ball night were elegant but far less imposing than London's grand ballrooms. The crowd was respectable: gentry, professional families, military officers, a scattering of minor nobility. The atmosphere was provincial in the best sense. Less cutthroat competition, more genuine conviviality. Eloise entered in a gown of deep rose silk, simply cut but beautifully made. Dr. Fielding had been invited to join their party, and he offered his arm with a warm smile. "You look splendid," he said quietly, like someone who knows her own worth. They had been there perhaps half an hour, enjoying the music and the dancing, when Eloise noticed a stir near the entrance. A party of obvious London aristocracy had arrived, the kind of visitors who came to Bath for a fortnight to take the waters and condescend to the locals. And at the centre of the group, unmistakable even at a distance, was the Duke of Ashford. Eloise felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Dr. Fielding's hand covered hers, where it rested on his arm. "Are you well?" he asked, concern evident. Yes, I did not expect—" She could not finish the sentence. The Duke had not seen her yet. He was speaking to his companions, two gentlemen and a lady whom Eloise did not recognize, but it was only a matter of time before their paths crossed in the limited space of the assembly rooms. "We can leave if you wish," Cordelia said firmly. "You owe him nothing." But Eloise surprised herself. "No," she said, lifting her chin, "I will not be driven away, not again, not from a place where I have every right to be." The confrontation came during the interval. Eloise was conversing with the wife of a local magistrate when she felt the shift in the room's attention. The Duke had recognized her. She could feel his gaze, cold and assessing, from across the room. Then he was approaching, his companions trailing behind. "Miss Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of ice wrapped in courtesy. "I had not expected to encounter you in Bath. I had heard you had retired from society." Every eye in the vicinity was now fixed on them. The magistrate's wife looked alarmed, clearly aware of some undercurrent but uncertain of the details. Eloise met the Duke's gaze directly. A year ago, she would have looked away, blushed, stammered. Now she simply regarded him calmly. "Your Grace, I have indeed retired from London society, which I found uncongenial. Bath, however, suits me very well." "Indeed?" His eyebrow arched. "I am surprised you have been received here, given circumstances." It was a direct attack, an attempt to reopen the wound and humiliate her anew. But Eloise had spent months rebuilding herself. His power to hurt her had diminished. "The society of Bath," Cordelia interjected coolly, "values substance over superficial pedigree. My niece has been warmly received by all who matter." The Duke's attention shifted to Cordelia, recognition dawning. "Miss Cordelia Pemberton, I have heard of your writings. Quite radical, I understand. Quite logical, Your Grace, though I appreciate that to some, logic appears radical." A flush rose in the Duke's cheeks. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, particularly by women. His companion, a striking blonde whom Eloise now recognized as Lady Harriet Ashford, the Duke's recently widowed cousin, laughed lightly. "Oh, Alexander, you are too easily provoked. Miss Pemberton, Miss Cordelia, I hope you're enjoying the evening. The assembly rooms are quite charming, are they not? So refreshingly unpretentious." It was a subtle dig at the provincial setting, but delivered with a smile that made it difficult to challenge directly. Dr. Fielding, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Unpretentious and genuine, Lady Harriet. One finds that in smaller gatherings, conversation turns to ideas rather than gossip, a welcome change for those of us engaged in serious work." The Duke's gaze sharpened as he noticed Dr. Fielding properly for the first time. "And you are?" Dr. Marcus Fielding. I practice medicine here in Bath and have recently returned from establishing a hospital in Calcutta. A physician. Maybe. The Duke's tone made it clear that he considered this barely a step above a tradesman. How industrious. Essential, actually, Eloise said quietly. Dr. Fielding's research has saved countless lives. He is preparing a comprehensive text on tropical diseases that will serve as the standard reference for decades. I'm honored to assist him with the manuscript. The Duke's expression flickered. Surprise, perhaps, that she would speak so assertively, or confusion that she would involve herself in such unfashionable pursuits. You are assisting a physician with medical writing? He made it sound vaguely scandalous. How remarkably peculiar. How remarkably useful, Eloise corrected. I have discovered that being useful is far more satisfying than being merely ornamental. The silence that followed was electric. Eloise had not raised her voice, had not been rude, but she had drawn a line that everyone present could see. She would not be cowed. Not here. Not anymore. Lady Harriet broke the tension with another light laugh. How absolutely fascinating. Perhaps we are all too ornamental in London. The country air does seem to encourage such independent thinking. She touched the Duke's arm lightly. Come, Alexander. I believe the dancing is about to resume, and you did promise me a set. The Duke allowed himself to be led away, but not before giving Eloise one last look, this time with something other than disdain. Confusion, perhaps, or the beginning of reassessment. As they departed, Dr. Fielding exhaled slowly. That was remarkably well done. You handled him with perfect grace. I had an excellent example, Eloise said, smiling at her aunt. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but Eloise was aware that something significant had occurred. She had faced the Duke of Ashford, the man who had broken her engagement and systematically destroyed her reputation, and she had not crumbled. More than that, she had shown him that his opinion of her no longer defined her existence. She had found work that mattered, people who valued her, a life that was hers. Later that week, Dr. Fielding called at Cordelia's house with a formal request to speak with Eloise privately. They walked in the gardens, the spring flowers just beginning to bloom, and he took her hand gently. I know the past year has been difficult, he began. I know you came to Bath to heal from heartbreak, and I have tried to be patient. But I must tell you that my own heart is no longer my own. You have become essential to my happiness, Eloise. Your intelligence, your resilience, your kindness. I cannot imagine my future without you in it. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Eloise looked into his steady brown eyes, saw the genuine affection there, the respect, the partnership he was offering. It was not a strategic alliance or a social triumph. It was something far more valuable. A true companion who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Marcus, I will. The engagement was announced in the Bath Chronicle, a small notice that would never be seen by most of London. But it was seen by the Duke of Ashford, still taking the waters in Bath, and when he read it over breakfast, his coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Miss Eloise Pemberton, engaged to Dr. Marcus Fielding, moving forward, building a life, apparently entirely unbothered by his existence. For the first time in nearly a year, the Duke of Ashford felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty, and beneath that, something he had not expected to feel about Eloise Pemberton ever again: curiosity. The wedding was planned for late June, a simple ceremony in Bath Abbey, followed by a modest breakfast at Cordelia's house. The guest list numbered 40, friends from the Thursday salon, medical colleagues, a handful of Eloise's former London acquaintances who had remained loyal through scandal, and her immediate family. Her parents and Thomas travelled from Hertfordshire, visibly relieved that their daughter had secured a respectable, if not spectacular, match. Thomas, now employed as a clerk in a solicitor's office and slowly paying off his debts, embraced his sister fiercely. "You deserve happiness," he whispered. "I am so sorry for what my foolishness cost you." "You cost me an unhappy future," Eloise told him gently. Your debts freed me from a man who valued breeding over character. I consider it a service, however unintentionally rendered. But before the wedding could take place, an unexpected visitor appeared at Cordelia's door. It was Lady Harriet Ashford, the Duke's widowed cousin, arriving in an elegant barouche and requesting an audience with Miss Pemberton on a matter of some delicacy. Eloise received her in the drawing-room, curious but wary. Lady Harriet was fashionably dressed in lavender silk, her blonde hair styled in the latest mode. She accepted tea and looked around the pleasant but unpretentious room with what might have been approval. "I imagine you are wondering why I am here," Lady Harriet began without preamble. "I have come to offer an apology on behalf of my cousin, though he does not know I am doing so." Eloise blinked. "An apology? The Duke behaved abominably toward you last year. I was not in England during the worst of it. I was in France, dealing with my late husband's estate. But I have since learned the extent of his campaign against your reputation. It was cruel and disproportionate, and he is only now beginning to realize it." "I see." Eloise kept her voice neutral. "What has prompted this revelation?" Lady Harriet sighed. "Several things. Seeing you here in Bath, clearly flourishing without him. Learning of your engagement to a man who is by all accounts brilliant and devoted, but mostly—" She hesitated, then continued. "A letter was recently discovered. It fell from behind a panel in the Duke's study at Ashford Park during renovations. It was addressed to him, dated nearly 18 months ago, in your hand." Eloise felt her heart stutter. "A letter? But I wrote to him only once after the engagement ended, and that was to ask if he might show mercy to my brother. He never replied." "This was not that letter," Lady Harriet said quietly. "This letter was written before the engagement was broken. In it you explained that your brother's debts had been deliberately manufactured by Lord Reginald, the Duke's brother, as a form of sport, that Reginald had targeted Thomas specifically because he knew of your engagement and wanted to cause trouble for Alexander. You pleaded with the Duke to investigate before acting, to speak with you before making any decisions based solely on Reginald's account. You even offered to break the engagement yourself if he wished, but asked that he not blame your family for Reginald's machinations." The words hung in the air. Eloise remembered writing that letter. She had spent an entire night composing it, pouring out the truth about Reginald's cruelty, begging the Duke to look beyond the surface scandal. She had sealed it and given it to a footman to deliver directly to Ashford House. She had waited for days for a response, for any acknowledgement that he had read it. When none came, when instead the notice of the broken engagement appeared in the Times, she had assumed he had read her explanations and found them insufficient or unbelievable. "The letter never reached him," Eloise said slowly, realization dawning. "Apparently not. The footman must have left it in the Duke's study, and it somehow slipped behind the panel, perhaps when papers were being moved, or during cleaning. Alexander never saw it. He broke the engagement and conducted his campaign against you, believing that you had offered no explanation, no defense, that you had simply accepted the broken engagement without protest. He interpreted your silence as evidence of guilt or indifference." "My silence," Eloise repeated, something like anger beginning to kindle. "I wrote that letter. I poured out the truth. It was not my silence. It was his. He never asked me. Never gave me an opportunity to explain in person. He simply decided I was unworthy and proceeded to destroy me." Lady Harriet nodded. "Yes, that is what I've been trying to make him understand. The letter explains much, but it does not excuse his behavior. He should have spoken with you directly before acting. He should not have engaged in a campaign of public humiliation, even if he believed you complicit in your brother's disgrace. He behaved like a man who had been personally betrayed, rather than one who had simply decided to end a courtship." "Why did he?" Eloise asked, the question she had carried for over a year finally finding voice. "Why did he hate me so much? What had I done to deserve such venom?" Lady Harriet looked uncomfortable. "I believe, and this is only my interpretation, that Alexander had allowed himself to care for you more than he intended or even acknowledged to himself. When the scandal broke and you offered no explanation, or so he thought, he felt betrayed at a depth he had not anticipated. He had been raised to suppress emotion, to value duty and propriety above all. Feeling hurt was foreign and threatening to him. So he transformed hurt into contempt, convinced himself that you had never been worthy of his regard, and set about proving it to himself and everyone else. He destroyed my reputation because he felt hurt? Eloise's voice was incredulous. I am not excusing him. I am explaining him. Alexander has lived his entire life in a world where dukes do not admit vulnerability. When confronted with feelings he could not control, he eliminated the source rather than examining himself. I understand. Lady Harriet rose as well. I am not asking you to forgive him or to resume any connection. I suppose I am trying to prepare you. Alexander has asked to see you. He wants to apologize in person, to explain, I'm not entirely certain what he hopes to accomplish. I told him it was a terrible idea, that you had every right to refuse, that he has forfeited any claim on your time or attention. But he is a duke and accustomed to getting what he wants. I suspect he will attempt to speak with you regardless of my advice. Let him attempt, Eloise said calmly. I am under no obligation to receive him. They met in the drawing room, Cordelia positioned nearby as chaperone and guardian. The Duke looked different than Eloise remembered, less imposing somehow. There were shadows under his grey eyes, and his posture lacked its usual rigid confidence. Miss Pemberton, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. I have rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, and now find myself entirely inadequate to the task. I owe you an apology that no words can adequately convey. I acted abominably. I judged you without granting you the basic courtesy of an explanation. I then compounded that injustice by systematically destroying your reputation out of what I now recognize was wounded pride and misplaced anger. I was wrong. Entirely, inexcusably wrong. Eloise regarded him steadily. You have read my letter, then? Yes. Too late. And to my eternal shame, you tried to tell me the truth. I never gave you the chance to speak it aloud. I have since investigated my brother's activities and discovered that he did indeed deliberately target your brother, that it was part of a pattern of such manipulation. I have severed all connection with Reginald and settled Thomas's debts. How magnanimous, Eloise said coolly. And this absolves you? No, nothing absolves me. I am here not seeking absolution, but simply offering acknowledgement. You were blameless, I was cruel, and I have cost you dearly. I understand you are engaged to Dr. Fielding. I wish you every happiness. He paused, then added quietly, he is a fortunate man. I hope he realizes what he has. Eloise stood. Dr. Fielding values intelligence, integrity, and partnership. He would never break my trust over a scandal without speaking to me first. He would never seek to destroy me simply because his pride was wounded. In that respect, Your Grace, he is nothing like you. And yes, I am the fortunate one in our engagement. The Duke flinched as though struck, but nodded. I deserved that. I deserve far worse. I will leave you in peace, Miss Pemberton. I only wanted you to know that I recognize my errors and that I will carry the guilt of how I treated you for the remainder of my life. As he turned to leave, Eloise felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, precisely, but a release. Your Grace, she said. He turned back. I hope you learn from this. I hope the next woman you court is granted the respect and communication I was denied, and I hope you find whatever it is you are seeking, though I suspect what you most need to find is a better version of yourself. The Duke left Bath the following morning. Lady Harriet called once more before her own departure, bringing a small package. The Duke asked me to give you this. It is the £5,000 plus interest that was supposedly owed by your brother. He insists it belongs to your family as restitution. Eloise accepted it, knowing her father would weep with relief that Thomas could finally be free of the debt that had haunted him. It was not forgiveness, but it was justice. The wedding took place as planned, in June sunshine, with roses blooming throughout the abbey. Eloise wore a simple gown of cream silk and carried wildflowers. When Marcus took her hand and promised to love and honor her, she felt no regret for the Duchess's coronet she would never wear, for the grand estate she would never manage. She had chosen this life, this man, this future, and it was enough. 3 years later, Eloise Fielding stood in the surgery attached to the house she and Marcus had purchased on the outskirts of Bath, organizing case files and correspondence. The practice had flourished beyond their initial hopes. Marcus had become one of the most respected physicians in the region. His willingness to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay, earning him both admiration and a steady stream of referrals from grateful families. Eloise managed the administrative side, maintained the patient records, and continued to edit Marcus's medical writings, which had been published to considerable acclaim. But she had also begun writing under her own name. Her first article on the health conditions of women in workhouses had appeared in a reform journal and sparked considerable debate. 3 more had followed, each tackling subjects most ladies of her class would not acknowledge existed: maternal mortality, occupational diseases among factory workers, the intersection of poverty and illness. She signed them E.M. Fielding and endured occasional criticism for her unfeminine interests with equanimity. Marcus was proud of her work. Cordelia championed it, and the people who mattered, reformers, physicians, social activists, took her seriously. They had 2 children now, a daughter of 2 years named Cordelia after her great-aunt, and a son of 6 months, Thomas, named for Eloise's brother. The house was chaotic and happy, filled with children's laughter, medical consultations, and Thursday evening salons that had become even more eclectic than Cordelia's, attracting visitors from across England who were interested in medical reform and social justice. Eloise's parents visited regularly, her father visibly healthier now that financial pressures had eased. Thomas had proven himself in the law, rising to junior partner in his firm, and had recently married a sensible young woman who worked as a schoolteacher. The Pemberton family had not recovered their place in high society, but they had recovered their dignity and their stability, which Eloise considered far more valuable. On this particular morning, Eloise was drafting a letter to a London publisher who had expressed interest in a collection of her essays, when Marcus entered the surgery with an unusual expression, something between amusement and concern. "There is a visitor," he said. "Lady Harriet Ashford. She apologizes for calling without notice, but says she has news that, well, she insists you will want to hear it." Lady Harriet appeared a moment later, still elegant, but with a warmth in her expression that had been absent during their previous encounters. She accepted tea and admired the children before getting to the point of her visit. "I am leaving England for Switzerland," she announced. "I am to marry a professor of natural philosophy in Geneva, a widower with 3 children and absolutely no social standing whatsoever. My family is horrified." She smiled broadly. "I am delighted." "Oh, congratulations," Eloise said warmly, and meant it. "You seem genuinely happy." "I am. But that is not why I am here. I thought you should know that Alexander, the Duke, has also married, 2 months ago, a Miss Sophie Thornton, daughter of a country vicar. She has no fortune, no connections, no social brilliance. What she does have is intelligence, kindness, and the backbone to tell Alexander when he is being insufferable, which is apparently exactly what he needed." Eloise felt a flicker of surprised interest. "How did this come about?" "After Bath, after his encounter with you, Alexander changed. Not overnight. He is too proud and too set in his ways for that. But gradually, he began questioning his assumptions about what mattered in life. He dismissed his previous circle of sycophants. He became more involved in estate management in ways that actually benefited his tenants, rather than simply maximizing his income. He reconnected with an old school friend, a country rector, and through him met Miss Thornton. She was visiting her brother, the rector's curate. They debated theology and politics over dinner, and I gather she bested him soundly in every argument. He was smitten. "I am glad," Eloise said, and realized she meant it. "I hope she is happy, and that he treats her with the respect he should have shown me. He will. He is a different man. Not entirely different, but improved. Humbled, I think, in ways that were necessary. He asked me to tell you, if I ever saw you, that his marriage is in part a result of your example, that you showed him what it looked like to value substance over status, to build a life based on genuine partnership rather than strategic alliance." After Lady Harriet departed, Marcus found Eloise standing at the window, gazing out at the garden where little Cordelia was playing with her nurse. "Are you well?" he asked gently, slipping an arm around her waist. "I am," Eloise said. "I was just thinking about the strange paths life takes. If the Duke had not broken our engagement, if he had not spent a year destroying my reputation, I would never have come to Bath. I would never have met Cordelia's salon or you, or discovered that I could be more than a decorative wife. I would have been a duchess, but I would have been miserable." "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked. "The life you might have had." Eloise turned to face him, cupping his cheek with one hand. "Not for a moment. I have work I care about, children I adore, a husband who is my true partner. I have freedom to think and write and pursue interests beyond managing a household. What I have now is worth infinitely more than a title and an estate. The Duke scorned me, humiliated me, nearly broke me. But in doing so, he freed me to become who I was meant to be. I think in the end we are both better for the paths we chose, or had chosen for us." That evening, after the children were asleep and the last patient had departed, Eloise sat at her writing desk and began a new essay. This one would be different, more personal, more philosophical. It would be about the blessing of disappointment, about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to us redirects us toward the best thing that could have happened. It would be about resilience and rebirth, about the courage to build a new life when the old one crumbles. She would call it "The Golden Prison, on Freedom and the Grace of Closed Doors." As she wrote, the words flowing easily, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The Duke had scorned her for a full season, had made her a byword for disgrace and failure, but his cruelty had inadvertently given her the greatest gift, the necessity of discovering her own worth, independent of society's approval, of building a life based on her own values rather than others' expectations. She had bloomed where she was planted, not in the grand gardens of Ashford Park as a duchess, but in the modest house in Bath as a physician's wife, a writer, a mother, a woman who had discovered that true happiness came not from status or titles, but from purpose and love and the freedom to choose one's own path. The letter, the lost letter that had taken 18 months to find, had revealed her sacrifice to the Duke. But it had revealed something more important to Eloise herself, that she had survived his scorn and built something beautiful from the ashes of his rejection, and that was worth more than any coronet. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed Eloise's journey from heartbreak to happiness, please click the like button and subscribe to this channel for more historical dramas. Leave a comment telling me what you thought of the story, and share where in the world you are listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel and connecting with listeners across the globe. Until next time, may you always bloom where you are planted.